The PFL is changing. After years of mismanagement and bad decisions, as of late, it seems like the PFL is on a different track. At this point, with their PFL Dubai card alongside with other recent decisions, it does seem like there is more competent leadership and decision making at the top of the PFL. By the way, most of you are not subscribed, so if you're enjoying the content, be sure to hit that subscribe button. And also, if you are enjoying the content and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, alongside with other perks as well. But anyways, let's get into it. When you talk about MMA, you think about the UFC. They have the best roster, the best matchmaking, the best broadcast, the best commentators. Essentially, the UFC is better at everything than any other MMA organization. And outside of the UFC, it was a significant gap between number 1 and number 2 of MMA organizations. But for years, the number 2 MMA organization was Bellator. And what they were doing over there in Bellator was decent. Obviously, it didn't compare to the UFC in any way, but at the same time, when you compare Bellator to other MMA organizations like the PFL, like ONE, they were definitely better than those organizations. And for a while, the MMA space looked like just that. The UFC was the clear top dog in the MMA space. Bellator was a distant number 2, with some hardcore MMA fans watching certain Bellator fights, and for ONE and for the PFL, they were kind of just holding on for dear life. But in November of 2023, something significant happened. The PFL acquired Bellator and their roster, and this move was met with excitement. Now you're talking about combining 2 rosters, Bellator as well as the PFL, and at that point you could legitimately be talking about a decent roster that could somewhat compete with the UFC and maybe take some viewership away from the UFC. Or at least that's what we thought. As when the PFL officially acquired Bellator, they made a couple of announcements, and in my opinion, they made some significantly bad decisions. As for their first and worst decision they made is they decided to keep their Bellator roster separate from their PFL roster. And this move made no sense from the beginning. The whole point of bringing in Bellator's roster to your organization is to combine both of your rosters together and form an overall better roster. The whole point of acquiring Bellator was to compete with the UFC, or at the very least, make your own organization better, but the fact that they were just acquiring Bellator initially to have them as a separate entity made absolutely no sense from the very beginning. And a lot of fans were complaining about this, and a lot of the excitement that the PFL got initially when they acquired Bellator was quickly starting to dwindle as fans started to hear what the PFL's plans were with the new acquisition. And the other odd decision the PFL made initially after acquiring Bellator is they decided they were going to do March Madness style tournaments for their MMA events. And although this may sound cool on paper, in reality this doesn't work. It's been tried a bunch of different times in different organizations and it's never worked. Because at the end of the day, the fans want to see specific matchups, and especially they want to see the best fight the best. But when you have these March Madness style tournaments, you don't always get that. Due to injuries, due to certain guys pulling off upsets, you don't always see the fights that the fans want to see most. So the majority of fan reaction to both of these decisions were pretty negative, but regardless of the fan reaction, the PFL decided to move ahead with their plans, and they decided to keep the roster separate alongside with the fact that they were going to do these March Madness tournament style MMA events. But unfortunately, the mismanagement didn't stop there, as before their first PFL event after acquiring Bellator, they decided to make some huge signings. They signed former UFC champion Francis Ngannou alongside with Jake Paul, and both these signings in a vacuum aren't necessarily a negative, but when you look at the amount of times both of these guys fought with the company alongside with the contracts they got, it was absolutely catastrophic. As for Francis Ngannou, he was making an exorbitant amount of money for each one of his fights, while also at the same time having a clause in his contract that forced the PFL to pay a ton of money to Francis's opponents as well. And this sort of contract kind of has the PFL trapped in a way, because if Francis Ngannou fights out there, the PFL is almost going to go near bankrupt, as Francis Ngannou has an extraordinary amount of money owed to him in each one of his fights, alongside with the fact that his opponent also needs to get a substantial amount of money. And when you look at these PFL events, they don't really generate all that much money, as even on the one card that Francis fought in the PFL that was supposed to be their biggest card yet, their pay-per-view numbers came back terrible, and when you look at the arena wasn't even full. So obviously the PFL took a substantial loss on that event. But the reason for why I say Francis has a PFL trapped is because even when he's not fighting, he's on the board of PFL Africa. And because of that, he's getting paid a substantial salary just for being on the board. So whether or not Francis Ngannou fights for the PFL, it doesn't really matter. The PFL is still paying this guy. And when you look at Jake Paul, after signing with the company a few years ago, he's never even fought with the company, not even once. So I think both of these signings, although they may sound decent on paper, when you look at their contract and when you look at the reality, I think they were catastrophic bad moves for the PFL. But all of those issues are not even to mention the production, because when you watch a UFC event, outside of the roster, outside of the matchmaking, outside of the commentators, one thing you know for sure is the production is going to be on point. But when you watch a lot of these PFL events, it's pretty clear that their production is not all the way there yet. There's a lot of issues, there's a lot of dead space, there's a lot of dead time, cameras are not necessarily the highest quality at times, and it just seems like there's so many different production issues that shouldn't be happening for a professional MMA organization. So clearly there was a lot going wrong for the PFL. And due to all those issues, the PFL wasn't really doing all that well. Not too many people were watching their events, not too many people were going to their events, and many were questioning how many years did the PFL have left before they went bankrupt. But as of late, things are finally starting to change, and they're finally starting to change for the better. The PFL finally combined their roster with Bellator, they finally fixed some of their production issues, they're starting to move away slightly from that March Madness style tournament, and they're starting to focus a little bit more on their pay-per-view events and stacking up those cards. As when you look at their upcoming event at PFL Dubai, the card actually looks really good from top to bottom. At this point, it's pretty clear that Usman Nurmagomedov alongside with Paul Hughes are probably the two biggest stars in the company, and their first fight against each other turned out to be a great fight. So the fact that they're putting them up right back against each other for a pay-per-view event alongside with a lot of other really good fights sprinkled throughout the card is definitely a step in the right direction. Outside of their PFL Dubai card coming up, they also are doing a pretty good job at hosting some events in Africa, and the two events that they hosted for PFL Africa turned out to be pretty successful events. And of course, that's not even to mention that going over to Africa could lead to some really good prospects joining the PFL and bolstering the roster. So overall, I do think the PFL is headed in a much better direction at this point as compared to what they were doing initially. And although they're nowhere near to competing with the UFC, I think the fact that they are making right decisions could carve out somewhat of a lane for themselves. As when you look in the fighting space and you look at some different up-and-coming organizations like Misfits Boxing, like Dirty Boxing, like Bare Knuckle Boxing, like ONE FC, there's a lot of different organizations out there that are doing a really good job at not trying to compete with the UFC, but carving out their own individual lane. And I do believe that PFL could turn themselves into one of those organizations with good decision making, which as of late, it seems like the decision making has been much better. And who knows, with great decision making going forward, like signing some young, highly touted up-and-coming prospects by offering them more money than the UFC does, slowly by slowly, the PFL could legitimately turn themselves into a great MMA organization. Of course, at this point, they are pretty far away from the UFC or pretty far away from becoming a great MMA promotion, but at the end of the day, they do have the funds, and it does seem like they are headed in a much better direction at this point. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the PFL could eventually ever compete with the UFC, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these two videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out, guys.